And from that moment, I was like, every single algorithm that we build has societal impact. No matter how innocuous it may seem, as a data scientist, I am changing the world that we live in. I have to take this seriously. What someone gets when they Google or get a summation of Google responses, it changes what someone's perception of reality is. That changes the world they exist in by an algorithm. We have to take accountability for that.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of The Long Game. Did you know that only 17% of the global sustainability goals set out by the UN for 2030 are on track? There's a lot of talk about how can we accelerate the growth and acceptance of these goals, and AI is one of the biggest movements in that conversation to advance those goals. Today I talked with Alison Cossette, longtime data scientist and expert in graphs and building Gen AI. We talk about everything from blockchain in outer space to the White House's most recent memorandum on how they are going to select vendors for using AI. We talk about the impact of AI in everyday life and how Alison specifically had a experience where she was working with a hospital and her decisions and the company's decisions around what data to include or not include in the model building impacted her community in a very meaningful way. There's so much that we get into. Alison is a wealth of knowledge around graph technology, around AI, around the advocacy for building with intention, building with thought, and building with ethics when it comes to building software. And I learned a tremendous amount. I hope you enjoy and learn something. What is the Interplanetary Blockchain Committee?
The Interplanetary Blockchain Committee is a group of very forward-thinking folks who have spent time contemplating, as we populate Mars, how will we handle interplanetary currency transactions, and how do we manage the signal across space?
Obviously.
Clearly.
As one does. What maybe just to what's the 30-second solution? Do we have this 30-second solution, or is it in great debate as to what is optimal?
Well, it's still in great debate, but thankfully we do have someone on the committee who has a large amount of experience in satellite telecommunications. And the idea is that the blockchain happens locally, and that there are spots in between where so the real challenge is that as the signal gets sent through space, frames will drop, packets will drop. And so the idea is that it's a consistent stream. So it continues to send over and over until that portion is complete. And then it will continue to move on from there. So really, it's about redundancy for completion.
It's fascinating. I mean, again, the fact that people are already solving this problem, and it is a real problem that we will have. So blockchain in space.
Yes. Who knew?
So what would you say that you do, Alison?
Oh, what do? I do a few different things. I am someone who is always moving forward, but still driving the car. You hear that conversation of how do we fix the tire while we're still driving? That's what I do. So what does that actually mean transactionally in life? I work on a number of different startups right now. Most of that or all of that is actually focused on responsible AI and how do we create tools that really do what AI is supposed to do, which is help move humanity forward. And it sounds very fluffy, but when we think about it transactionally, the biggest challenge that I see that we have and where I like to put all my focus is in where does our data come from and how do we address training data in AI applications. So I work on a couple of different initiatives in that area. I do a number of different volunteer pieces with NIST, with the AI Alliance. And I'm also a great deep lover of graph databases and do developer advocacy for Neo4j, longtime graph fan. And so really, I do a little bit of everything, but always about how can we get the best output and how can we get an output that is thoughtful.
That's a phenomenal summary of a very diverse career and experience.
I've done one or two things, Elijah.
Just a few.
Yeah.
I saw your article that you just published, kind of reviewing the memorandum coming out of the White House and the OBM on AI governance and AI in government. Can you break that down? Talk a little bit about what that is, and yeah, start with what it is.
Yeah. So, what it is, the US government has a phenomenal budget. They're actually the biggest buyer of AI tools in America. And the OMB is the Office of Management and Budget. And what they have done is they recently put out a memorandum around what are the parameters regarding buying AI across agencies. And there are a few pieces that are really important. One is the concept of interoperability, meaning they're really concerned about vendor hijacking. They're very concerned about having one vendor, whatever it may be, the government's LLM or whatever, and being so tied into a vendor that we can end up with price gouging, or I don't know if you remember that the conversation around the $10,000 hammer many years ago. And so interoperability is a really important part of it. Another aspect is, which makes me very happy, the idea of transparency of the training data and an understanding of what is going into these systems. Where does that data come from? Is it having any impact on privacy? Where are the biases in that data? Because remember, the government does many things. It's not just about, taxes and making sure that the national parks are taken care of and the highways look good. It's about Medicare and Medicaid. It's about the VA. It's the DoD. We're talking about very high risk scenarios, and being able to have an understanding of where that data comes from is really important. The other thing is they're really focused on what are the metrics and where is the responsibility of the vendor models. So not just we purchased this tool, we put it into place, but what is the responsibility of maintaining that over time? And the overarching principle is that the government is really making a statement about responsible AI. There's three things. There's the interoperability, there's a transparency into the training data, there's the understanding of risk and responsibility. But overall, what they're saying is that responsible AI needs to be the foundation upon which everything is built. Not just because it's a do-good and not because, we're just trying to do feel-good things. They're saying it's really important to the success of the actual AI implementations. And we can see, as I mentioned, if you're the DoD, you have to know where every single piece of unstructured data has come from. We talked with, some folks at the AI Risk Summit this summer, and there was someone from the DoD there. And we had a conversation. What about if let's say we're using, I don't know, a language model that leverages Common Crawl. There's so much nonsense on the internet. Is that what you want to be basing it on? Right? So how do they make sure that there isn't some nefarious piece of information or some sort of opportunity for someone to inject under the hood where it can come out, because we have these black boxes? And so by having that clarity on transparency, it really starts to mitigate risk that's significant, that could do significant harm if not managed.
Yeah, that's super interesting. Just even the concept of someone dumping false data on the internet in a place where it thinks AI is going to crawl it and learn from it to put an innate bias in the LLM that is then a black box and not seen. Like maybe that's far-fetched, maybe it's not, but it does show kind of, if we keep it a black box and we keep a lack of transparency into what's going into these models, you don't necessarily know where the outcomes are coming from.
Exactly. A lot of folks like to use Llama because they can say, oh, it's on-prem, they're not taking my training data. I mean, do you want to use Meta's data if you're the DoD? Probably not, right? I mean, talk about crazy things on the internet. So it's an interesting point. And I think what's important about it for me is you've got, Joy Bulamini, you've got Raman Chowdhury, you've got like all of these folks who have been beating the drum of responsible AI for so long. And to be honest, our industry's response is, oh, yeah, that's nice. Yeah, that's nice. Oh, we'll be careful about GDPR. Oh, we won't use this in the EU. But now the government is saying that's not enough anymore. This really is important. And I believe that this is a bellwether moment for our industry to say the largest purchaser of AI in this country has stated responsible AI is the foundation upon which we must purchase. That's going to have implications. Anyone who's a large vendor needs to start thinking about this, and they need to start thinking about it now.
So to kind of pull on that front, because this is the public sector, this is the government, which I don't know what everyone's opinion is, but typically you think of government as slow and lagging behind and maybe kind of bringing down the regulation hammer or other things to kind of slow down innovation. But do you think that this is going to impact the private sector and it's going to kind of set the gold standard? Why?
I do. It's interesting because we do think of, when we think of the government, we think more of the post office. But once you actually start going to various government conferences, what you find is there are segments of the government, particularly in the areas of national defense, where there's actually a lot of money for innovation, where you can come to them with an idea and you can get funding, non-equity diluting funding to build something. You say, it speaks to this very specific part of this directive, and we want to get funding to do that. And the government will do it. So I remember I was at the GovAI Summit last year. It's coming up again really soon down in Virginia. And person after person from agency would get up, they would talk about what they want to do. And almost without fail, at the end, the last thing they would say is, if you have ideas, come to us. Come tell us where we want. So, ironically, the government is actually very forward facing when it comes to certain types of innovation. And what I think is interesting about this particular memo is they're talking about interagency communication as well. So, how can, instead of having every agency doing all these different projects and working with all these different vendors, how can that become a more coordinated effort? So success in one agency will lead to success in another agency. And there are many people who are specifically working with, when you think about the supply chain of the government, right? Just think about the military alone, the supply chain. So much can be done in investigating these sorts of redundancies. So I think if you're interested in any kind of a startup, contemplate what are the challenges that the government has right now. And listen, we are really smart people. We have a lot of folks building really impactful tools. So let's look into ways that we can. I just think the government is a very fertile ground for innovation and sales. And if you understand what it is that they're looking for and you understand what the parameters are of what's going to make it successful and what they need, there's a lot of opportunity.
That's very interesting. I mean, it's a customer segment like any other, and it's not necessarily like you said. There are different aspects of government. There are parts that are far more nimble and are
Yes.
beating the drum, saying, "Hey, we need solutions here,"
Yeah.
and then there's others that are maybe slower and saying, "Let's regulate." But it's not one size fits all for government.
No, and I think what's interesting about the memorandum is, everyone's been saying, oh, they'll never pass the law. California, they were looking at transparency and
This
copyright.
memorandum specifically was like unsure if it was going to be passed.
No, there was Senator Schiff, I think, from California. There was something that was brought into the legislature, and it was specifically around transparency of training data and a requirement to identify copyright in different pieces. And it didn't pass, it didn't move through. So everybody thinks that it's got to come from legislation. But when we think about it, the buying power of the government is actually even more of a factor because listen, it's America. We're a capitalist country. All of our AI companies, everybody's looking to make money, and the government is speaking with its checkbook right now. And so we don't necessarily have to sit and wait for regulation. If you're a product manager, you have to look at where they're spending their money. And that, I believe, has more of an impact on the private sector than what the regulation may be.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Kind of follow the money. And then when you extrapolate out, looking at kind of this memorandum, this kind of guideline for agencies to buy AI software, what do you see as the second order effects 1 year, 5 years, 10 years down the line?
Yeah, well, there's what I hope will be the effect. And my hope really is that this is the moment that we as an industry stand up and say, oh, maybe it's time to put these parameters into the products of what we do. Um, I do believe that there are people who are going to really run at this moment of opportunity. And I believe that we're going to see that shift because listen, any business, when you see someone making money in a market, heads start to turn. And I definitely believe that it's going to make that change. Now, do I think that private sector will follow that rule the way they buy AI? Absolutely not. Right? They want, I mean, right? We're all humans, we're all in business, right? We're all trying to make money. I don't think it's going to change the nature of capitalism. I don't believe that people will all of a sudden say, oh, it's not responsible. I'm not going to buy it. Even the eco movement, people still drive big cars. Like, let's be honest.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I don't think it will change necessarily the way the private sector buys AI, but I think it will change the way that the private sector builds AI to sell to the government. And maybe it will ripple out, one would hope, but I'm not as optimistic about that. But I do believe that it's going to make a change in the way we build and how we think about what it is that we're building from day one. Something that's concerning me right now, I saw the Meta glasses, right? Everybody wants their Meta Ray-Bans. They're the clear frames sold out. They're limited edition. And the first thing I do whenever I look at a new tool, the first thing I always check is what are the terms of service and can you use my data to train AI models? It's just what I do.
Are you looking for that term in the terms of service, or
Always.
do you actually okay?
Oh
And do
no,
you
I
use
read
AI
them because
to find that, or do you read it?
I'm a huge TOS nerd in general, but yeah, yes, this is how I spend my time. But what you find with the Meta Ray-Ban glasses is they do phenomenal things. You can be, what is it? I can't remember what the term is, but it's, click and analyze or whatever. And it will take the picture of what you have and it'll send it to Meta and Meta will run its AI and give you back information, which is great. We love that. I was like, oh, this is so cool. I should do this. I'm always looking for how do I opt out of you using my data to train your AI systems? With these glasses, there is no opt out. Anytime you send a photo to be analyzed, it is clearly states that it is part of the training data and there is no way out. People say, okay, that's fine. But what if I'm in my own home and I'm curious about something in the room, but my son's friends are here and pictures of them are now out being used for training data? They never opted into that. I'm in public. I have kids, so this is what comes up for me, right? I'm in public. I'm at a playground. Yes, it's public, but do you really want all of this? Do you want pictures of your home in the training data? I don't. Do you want pictures of your children in training data? I absolutely 100% do not. And so we have to really start being very discerning because when I think about it, I'm like, okay, so I'm going to pay $300 to become a data collector for Meta. How does that work? Right? Yes, you give us these shiny, glitzy tech tools, but what's the real story here? And so these are the kinds of things that concern me. And this is why I'm really committed to supporting tools and supporting initiatives that allow us to have agency over the way we interact with the AI and what our data footprint is being leveraged inside of these tools.
How did you get on this journey? I mean, what was it about data governance, data lineage, and just like this is a very specific world, but you clearly are very passionate about it as well. how did you end up in this space? How did you know this is your mission in life?
Yeah, it's a combination of two things. One, my very first career, I was in music management, and so I studied publishing contracts when I was young. So I had that understanding of artistic ownership, and that was sort of innately in me. Then later on, I will be honest, I was working for an organization and I was building a model, and I was told that I couldn't bring in a very important piece of information into the model. And it was in a healthcare setting. It was a very high impact. And I was like, okay, well, I'm young. I'm just going to do what I'm told. I was told, don't be smart, just do what you're asked to do. So I did. And a little while later, an article came out in the local newspaper, and it was particularly about, I'm going to tell the story. And I'll be honest with you, I've never been super public about this story before, but I think it's important. So, all right, universe, here we go. Taking the big leap. I was working for a local hospital, and my job was to do workforce planning. How many doctors do we need, and where do we need them in this rural setting in order to serve the community? And one of the challenges we have, I live in Vermont. A lot of people don't want to work in Vermont. Getting doctors to come here is very challenging. And so the wait times were really long. At that point, there's a metric called third next available, which is what is the third next available appointment to meet someone. At that point in time, there was a 366-day wait for child psychiatry. Since
Wow.
that time, we've had massive problems with, child mental health. Noah Kahn, who's from Vermont, is actually doing a lot in the nonprofit space to support the mental health of children here. I have special needs children. So this is a service that I use as a mother. And I was told, no, we are supposed to use an assumption that we are currently meeting demand. So the model was only allowed to say, oh, we're going to have these demographic changes, and these people are getting older, and so many people are going to turn 50 and need a colonoscopy. And I'm sitting here, I'm like, how am I, as a mathematician and a data scientist, not going to include a calculation for unmet demand? The workforce model is completely false and completely useless. And so I live in this community. These are my parents. Everybody's complaining. They can't get an appointment. They can't get in to see anybody. And this article comes out in the newspaper and it says, yes, people are complaining about these wait times, but our model clearly states that we're really on track and we're planning appropriately. And it just made me sick because that was what I had built and I knew it was wrong. And there was nothing I could do about it. And from that moment, I was like, every single algorithm that we build has societal impact, no matter how innocuous it may seem. And this one certainly didn't even seem innocuous. But we have to, as a data scientist, I am changing the world that we live in and that my family lives in and my friends live in and my community lives in and my country lives in. I have to take this seriously. And that was it. And so from that moment, this concept of responsible AI and thoughtful model building was really ever present. So I taught for a number of years. I taught boot camps and I, taught for different kinds of boot camps for universities. And I had a non-negotiable, which is I will teach for you, but I will always talk about ethics in every single course that I teach. And if that's not okay for you, that's fine, but I'm not your person. And it's just been how I have been always. So I'm like, it's a lot of words, but one more thing is I used to work for a market research company and they were great. I loved them. And they were NPD, they're now Circana. And I would use the example of what I do every day with my students. And I'd say, okay, one of the things that I do is I do feature imputation on market research data. So receipts that come in, it says it's a t-shirt. Is it a men's t-shirt? Is it a women's? Is it children's? Is it unisex? And, unisex at the time, it's a small segment, right? We all know that when you have imbalanced classifications, it's always hard to pick up the signal. And so I say to my students, I say, how much of a societal impact does my imputation of who's wearing this t-shirt have? And they're like, oh, it's not so bad. It's not like you're working at the hospital or the DoD, right? I'm like, okay, so if I build a model that says unisex isn't on the rise, or nobody buys unisex t-shirts because it's an imbalanced data set, it doesn't come up that often, it's not so important if that particular identification happens. Who are the people that use this data? Well, it's used by buyers in stores. It's used by designers. It's used by manufacturers. So, okay. So I haven't identified a shift towards unisex garments. People are buying this data and making decisions upon it. Let's say they don't see that that market is shifting. I'm someone who is somewhere on the gender spectrum. I'm looking for a unisex garment. I go into a store and I can't find what I need because some mathematician in some office somewhere said, it's a small element of the classification. It's not that important. All of a sudden, something that seems really like, who cares? It's okay. It's not so okay. And so that's just at every point through my career, no matter where I am, I'm like, okay, what's the impact here? What's the impact there? What does this mean? I worked at a bundled payment company, and we were talking about how we were trying to help doctors make money keeping people healthy. It matters, right? So everywhere that I went and everything that I did, it was always so glaringly obvious to me what our impact is as builders. And I don't think that was part of the curriculum. And especially now, we've had this shift towards Gen AI, the ultimate black box. And AI used to be, us mathematicians, us data scientists in the corner who had this very heavy training on rigor and being able to build our model reports where we take accountability. I didn't include this feature. I did include that feature. We don't have data from this particular community. So we're going to address it this way. And now everybody's building with AI, and there's not that rigor that we used to have. And so what the government is saying and where that's going, to me, is very heartening, because we all need to recognize that what we are doing, we as an industry are literally changing society every day. What someone gets when they Google, what someone gets when they now Google or get a summation of Google responses, it changes what someone's perception of reality is. That changes the world they exist in by an algorithm. We have to take accountability for that. I
That's
know,
an
a lot of
amazing
words.
story.
And yes, very
That's
passionate.
amazing. I think the part that, I come from an application background, right? So building software applications that you click and you interact with and they do something for you. And there is impact that you can have if that application has scale, such as how the newsfeed, how you serve up information on Facebook, et cetera, that shapes how you view the world.
Yeah.
But I think with data science or data in general, it's far more hidden how that impacts you. And so if you are working with data, whatever size your company is, if you're building a model or if you're building software that is powered by data, or you're selecting what to include and not include, the rippling impact of doing that with the rigor that you're talking about is massive. It's absolutely massive. And you might think that you're just doing what's good for the company, of kind of, oh, we're going to use a certain aspect of the data, or we're going to make sure it's leaning towards a certain way because that's the outcome that drives revenue, so our startup won't fail so that we can get customers. But it has very long-term effects for each decision that you make when regarding data.
Yeah. I have a talk that never gets accepted, and it is called The Dark Side of Distance Metrics, or How Cosine Similarity Divided America. And what it's
I
about,
love that.
right? I mean, like, maybe somebody will watch this and say, come give this talk. And what it's about is about how, we all, over the last 10 years, we've all seen the echo chamber of Facebook. Well, how did that happen? I call it the chicken nuggets and Twinkies theory of recommendation systems, which is, if I have a robot in my house and I have a cooking dinner for my family, my kids, they don't love the vegetables, but like enough. We throw in some fruits, we throw in some vegetables, like, the asparagus gets us by on a bad day, right? Like we're okay. If I go away and travel, which I do often, and my robot just made what my kids wanted for dinner, I would come back and everyone would be living on chicken nuggets and Twinkies because recommendation systems are supposed to give you cosine similarity. Everybody's talking vectors now, so people know what this means. It's just going to give you more of what you ask for. And so what happened as data scientists were like, oh, this is great. I'm giving people what they want. Isn't this wonderful? And isn't this wonderful?
And they keep
That's
coming back and engaging more and more and more. So therefore,
exactly.
clearly, it's
And
a
so the
positive thing,
blinders
right?
get narrower and narrower and narrower because the more you give someone what they want, the spread of what you're choosing from is narrower. You're constantly taking out like the tails. And so that's what happened. And that's how we got to, alternate facts and people literally living like when people are focused on getting their information from these algorithmically driven sources, which everything is now. I mean, what do we have access to that isn't algorithmically driven? Literally, their world is different than someone else's. When I was a kid, we had books, right? You went to the library. I mean, I'm old. Like, we had encyclopedias, everybody had to go read them. We all had the same encyclopedia. We all had that same baseline of truth. We don't have that now. We're constantly shaped by what we interact with. And what we interact with is driven by choice. So, how do we? I mean, I would love us to be able to bring back like a random meter. So, on any recommendation system, I want to adjust the random meter, right? I mean, I like Sirius radio, but sometimes I miss just putting on FM and being like, what's next? I don't know, right? Turning the page of the newspaper. What's on the next page of the newspaper? I don't know. Let's see. And so I think that if on our recommendation engines, we as users had to choose how much randomness or how tight we want our recommendations to be, I firmly believe that that act alone would trigger something to say, I'm purposely getting what I want. I'm not asking for a wide truth. I'm asking for what I want. And I believe that that would change the way people see it. I don't know if it's true. It's a hypothesis. It's a theory. If I were in academia, I would definitely do research on it and do some A/B testing and see if that's true. But yeah, so many
It's
things.
also interesting too because what we want, I mean, just by exposing that and saying, hey, are you serving yourself exactly what you want? Or are you giving yourself an injection of randomness, of different weird random viewpoints? I think, again, that awareness just, if you just eat what's put in front of you every day and you don't know what it is, that's one thing. But if you have to make the conscious choice to go to McDonald's every day, that's a different thing. And you might think differently about it. And maybe you still do,
Yeah,
but at least you're more aware about what your actions are.
exactly. Exactly.
Where does this kind of tie into graph networks, and then particularly with regards to, this biased world that we do live in terms of, we're living in data silos with the current election as well. How does this play out from a graph perspective?
So I think graph can actually be can be a really impactful tool here. And I'll tell you why. When
And
we
maybe just define graph for
What
anyone
is
who's
what is
not
graph?
familiar with.
So
Yeah.
the way that the analogy that most or the explanation that most people understand is when you think about your social network, your LinkedIn, your Facebook. I know you, you know Joe, Joe knows Pam. So there used to be a thing on LinkedIn where it says, introduce me to someone who can introduce me to that person. Right. So there's a two hops. So if you know someone that I want you to introduce me to, that person is two hops away from me. Goes back to sort of the 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon or 6 degrees in general, which is that everything and everyone is connected. And so graphs are that concept, but around not just people, but all kinds of information. So maybe it's if we're looking at financial information, there's a company that there are asset managers that own shares in that company. So many asset managers own that company. Those asset managers own many companies. And so that's one kind of network. If you think of supply chain, I have an item like Amazon, right? I have a warehouse full of all of these items that need to get someplace. They're going to go to this station and then that station. You think about your Waze application. What different routes do I have? Which different paths and which different routes can I take? So, graphs are a way of organizing information. So, rather than being in tables where you've got columns and rows, the
Or spreadsheet.
information, yeah, your classic Excel spreadsheet, right? You know, SQL databases for the rest of us. It's that you have entities and relationships. So usually an entity is some sort of a noun. So it could be a product. The order is another entity. The order has connections to all of the products that were in that order. I, as a customer, have many orders and there are many products. You can sort of see the way that spreads. So, a graph database is a way of storing information based on the entities and the relationships that they have. Where does this come in with AI? It comes into a number of places, but the one that we talk about a lot, and that's really on the top of everyone's conversation right now, is around graph retrieval augmented generation. So we recognize, for those of you who don't know what RAG is when you ask the LLM a question. I don't want it to give me the general answer. I want it to give me an answer specific to, say, my internal company data or about something really specific. So, what will happen is you will take that prompt, it becomes a vector, bunch of numbers. It then goes out, cosine similarity, finds other things that are very similar to it in the information, takes each of those pieces that are in that same concept space and brings it back to answer the question. And that's great. But sometimes the question that I'm asking, if I say, tell me about cats, it may go out and find information about cats, but I want to know about the type of cats that are in my neighborhood. I don't want to know about cats in general. I want to know about cats in Vermont, right? We've got, you know, catamounts around here. And so, how do I get the information that I need? There's also times where it's a combination of not just what's in the unstructured data, but something structured as well. And that's where I think things get really interesting. So, if I'm asking, one of the demos that I do a lot is using 10K filings and SEC filings for companies. So, we have information about the company, we've got their filings, we've got the company, we've got their asset managers. So, I can say something like, which asset managers will be most impacted by a lithium shortage? Well, if I'm just looking at the 10Ks, I can find out some things about those, but I don't know which asset managers own those companies. So what happens is you go into the unstructured data and then you traverse the graph to get to the answer that you need. So it's a way of tying your structured data and your unstructured data into these types of questions. Graphs are also really good at things like fraud detection, supply chain management. So when we think about AI, we need to think about context and we need to think about connection. There's a man, Adam Lai, who's like my data science hero, who runs system.com. And their goal is to connect information. They started out in scientific research, they're now moving into climate change. You'll also see that Google has common data, which is a knowledge graph that you can actually query as well. Google itself actually found its success based on the graphs of links, something called PageRank. How do I know that this should be the best page? So I don't know if I got to your question. I got a little bit tied up in explaining graphs, but the real thing is we can't just look at data as a silo. We always have to look at the context. So we take the same idea of what's the impact. Let's look at the context of the data itself. We have to make these context-driven decisions and systems-driven decisions, not just this data point or that data point.
What is that outcome that happens? Say we get to the point where we have a perfect graph. Again, maybe it's a theoretical, right? But like we have a web of knowledge and everything is correctly linked and associated to everything else. So, you know, a mother is linked to their children. The children are linked to a job. The job is linked to an industry. That industry is, right? Just it's all mapped. Like, what is the outcome? How does that actually impact the systems that we build and the AIs that we build and so on and so forth?
Yeah, I mean, like every data scientist would say, the outcome, it depends, right? Are you using it for the forces of good or not, right? Can we somehow leverage this for interplanetary blockchain? I don't know. We'll see. I mean, but okay, let's take that example just for fun, right? Let's say there are ways that you can validate information. If we take a look at what blockchain was originally meant to do, blockchain is all graph, right? It's all about connections and where things are and how that can be validated. And it's the same sort of thing. How can we make sure that we have connected information? So, I mean, as always, the usefulness of a tool is equal to its power as a weapon. And that's the one thing that we always need to be really mindful of. So, how does it change AI? It's unlimited how it can change. It's really only capped by our imagination. We can look at things like, if I want to use something like that to build a tool that gives a broader range, imagine what broader range that I can get of viewpoints and information. I can say, find someone's opinion in the graph who is the furthest away from mine,
Right.
right? Find information that's the farthest away and bring it in. You could do samplings across those sorts of distances across the network itself and say, I want to pull mostly from here, but give me these tails this far out to sort of color that. So there's lots of ways. You tell me, what
Where
do
do
you
you,
think it could do?
I mean, I think one of the things that's interesting to me about data graphs are our innate biases towards wanting to have information that either aligns with our beliefs or is directly in opposition to our beliefs. I think there's like that's kind of where we live right now. It's we want either outrage or we want agreement. And so I think the more we have perspective on data on graphs, the more you can kind of get to that orthogonal where it's not binary, it's not completely against, it's not completely for, it's not necessarily in the middle, but it's a completely just like you said, random. It's just different, right? And so it's I think those different viewpoints, those different perspectives, those different data points can round out instead of just a linear spectrum of opinions where you're somewhere on a number line. It's multiple dimensions, right? So there's
Yes,
depth that you can have, there's height that you can have, and so you get a three-dimensional kind of thought and collective of thoughts that's not just this binary, you're either for it, you're against it, or you're kind of in the middle of it.
exactly. I mean, high dimensional space is where we live, right? So, and I love that because to your point, none of our opinions are linear. Everything that we have is based on these connections and these experiences and what we have. So, how could we possibly make decisions in two dimensions when we live in this very high dimensional existence? So, I'm on board with that.
What future do you hope for in the world of AI, LLMs, technology? Take it however you want.
Yeah, the word that always comes to me is thoughtful. Thoughtful building, thoughtful use, thoughtful understanding. Um, my son is actually looking into schools right now, and we got an email from someone, and completely not knowing what I do, they were talking about how they utilize AI in the school. They really teach the algorithmic literacy. They use these tools not only to teach the students, but to teach them discernment and to understand the world that they live in. Having algorithmic literacy is akin to understanding how the body works. There are people who spend their whole life never knowing anything about anatomy and physiology, but this is the house that we live in. You should understand how your body works, right? It makes you much more informed. It makes you able to take care of yourself. We have to do the same with algorithms and with technology. It is the world that we live in, and it literally creates our existence every day. We need to know how it works. That's the only way that we can have agency within it is by understanding this is a world I live in. This is who I want to be in that world. And I want to have agency to act in this world.
I think that's a beautiful vision. Allison, thanks for coming on the show.
Elijah, thank you so much for having me. This was really great.
This is a lot of fun. If people want to find you and learn more about your interplanetary plans as well as your impact in government and AI, where should they go?
The best place to find me is always on LinkedIn. I am really easy to find. I am very responsive. I'm always looking for good conversations and folks to collaborate with. So definitely reach out.
Thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you, Elijah.
If you enjoyed that episode, make sure you check out this video right here. And if you really enjoyed it and you listen to the end, take 2 seconds and share the love so someone else might find it by clicking the thumbs up button and subscribing. I appreciate you, and I hope you have a wonderful day. But click that button.